The orange notice was already taped to the iron gate wheel when I came down the trail at 6 in the morning. Diane Whitaker stood beside it on my dam, clipboard in hand, smiling for a phone camera held by a kid in an HOA polo shirt.
$2,400.
She read aloud, slowly.
For hoarding spring water that flows naturally to the community.
The kid grinned. And if it's not flowing by Friday, Diane added, looking past me toward wherever she imagined the sheriff would be standing, we'll have you removed from the dam ourselves. I didn't answer right away. I kept my eyes on the orange notice, the one she had taped onto a control wheel my grandfather installed in 1953, on a dam that sat on land the Bramble Creek Homeowners Association had never owned a single inch of. She thought she was citing a trespasser. She had no idea she was standing on my land while she did it. Her name was Diane Whitaker. She had been president of the Bramble Creek Estates Homeowners Association for 14 months, and she had been mailing me letters for 4 of them. I had not answered any of them. That, apparently, was why she had decided to come in person. Mr. Hollis. She turned to face me, the way someone turns to face a defendant. We've sent you 7 notices. You have, I said. You haven't responded. No. As of last night, the board has voted to enforce. I looked at the orange notice on the wheel. You taped that to my dam, I said. It is not your dam, Mr. Hollis. It's been my dam since 2014. Before that, it was my grandfather's. The water rights certificate is filed at the county recorder. The 1996 plat explicitly excludes this parcel from your subdivision. You are standing on private property. She gave me the tight, rehearsed smile of someone who had practiced this in a mirror. We've reviewed everything, she said. This water is community property. The board has determined that your obstruction of natural flow constitutes a community nuisance, and as president, I am within my authority to... You're not within your authority to stand on this dam. The kid with the phone stopped grinning. Diane did not stop. If it's not flowing by Friday, we will open it ourselves. The kid, perhaps sensing that his role had now expanded, stepped past me toward the spillway and began photographing the gate mechanism. He photographed the pump house. He photographed the secondary release valve. He did not ask. He did not look up. I let him. I knew what those photographs would show. I also knew what they would not show, which was the part of the system that actually mattered. I looked past Diane, down the slope, through the gap in the cedars, where you could see the back end of the subdivision. Her own house sat on the 3rd lot. Emerald lawn, 2 flowering crabapple trees, a sprinkler system I had heard, more than once on summer evenings, hissing through her side yard at dusk. Below her house, half a mile down the valley, was the Bramble Creek Community Pond, the glassy showpiece of the subdivision, the one in the marketing brochures, the one the HOA threw a 4th of July party around every summer. I had been releasing water into that pond, free of charge, for nearly a decade. More than my rights required, more than anyone had ever asked. I had done it because I liked watching the herons land there in the spring, and because I had never seen the point in being small about a thing as old as water. Standing on my dam that morning, looking at Diane Whitaker's lawn glittering in the early sun, I understood for the first time that she did not know any of that. She believed the water was hers because it had always come to her. I placed my hand on the iron gate wheel not to turn it, just to feel where it was. The metal was cold and grooved, precisely where I had worn it smooth over the years. I peeled the orange notice off slowly, careful not to leave adhesive on the iron. I folded it twice. I put it in my shirt pocket. Friday, Diane said again. The way people repeat a thing, when they think repetition, is the same as authority. Friday, I said. I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that the dam she had just cited me for was older than her subdivision, and that the deed locked in the box up at the house named exactly one owner of every drop of water above this ridge, and it was not her, and it was not her board, and it was not the community. And it never had been. She turned back to the kid with the phone and said, brightly, for the recording, compliance documented. I watched them walk back up the trail to where they had parked. I waited until I could no longer hear their voices. Then I looked at the wheel under my hand, and I looked down the valley at the pond she had built her whole presidency on. And I thought calmly, the way I think about most things about Friday. I walked back up the trail with the orange notice folded in my shirt pocket, and the morning sun finally clearing the eastern ridge. By the time I reached the house, the cedars were dropping their long shadows across the gravel, and Diane Whitaker's white SUV was already turning out of my driveway and back onto the county road below. I stood on the porch a moment and watched the dust settle. Then I went inside, took the orange notice out of my pocket, and laid it on top of the wooden box on my desk. The box was a footed walnut chest my wife had picked up at an estate sale years before she passed. I had been using it lately as a filing cabinet. I lifted the lid and dropped the orange notice in. It landed on top of 7 others. 7 prior letters from the Bramble Creek Estates Homeowners Association, each one stamped with their gold foil crest, each one addressed to me by the wrong middle initial, each one citing a different invented violation of a bylaw that did not apply to land they did not own. The first, from March, fined me $400 for an unauthorized structure, meaning the pump house my grandfather built in 1958. The second, from April, fined me $600 for non-conforming earthworks, meaning the dam. The third, in May, was the first to use the phrase that would become Diane's favorite: obstruction of natural waterways, as if water on private land owed an HOA a particular route. By June, the letters were arriving every 2 weeks. By July, they were certified. By August, they had stopped pretending to be requests and had started reading like verdicts. I had not answered any of them. Looking at them now, stacked under the orange one Diane had taped to my dam that morning, I understood for the first time that this had not been a clerical error. 8 letters did not happen by accident. 8 letters happened because someone, somewhere, had decided this land was theirs. I closed the lid of the box. I walked across the room to where the topographic maps hung on the wall, the old USGS quadrangles I had been collecting since my first job out of school, before personal computers, before GPS, when a young civil engineer learned a valley by tracing it with his thumb. The Bramble Creek quadrangle hung in a black frame above my desk. I had marked the property lines myself, in red ink, the year I inherited the land. You could see the whole thing in one glance. The valley ran roughly northeast to southwest, narrow at the top where my parcel sat against the ridge, widening as it dropped toward the county road. Bramble Creek itself, the actual creek, not the subdivision named after it, originated at a spring 200 yards north of my pump house, ran down through a small earthen impoundment my grandfather had dug in 1953, exited through a controlled spillway, and continued south down the natural channel. That was the geography that had existed for 70 years. Below it, on the same map in red ink, was the geography that came later. Bramble Creek Estates had been platted in 1996. A developer named Hollander had bought 160 acres at the south end of the valley and divided it into 96 lots. The original plat and I had a certified copy of it, because of course I did explicitly excluded my 22 acres from the subdivision. My parcel was outlined on the plat in a separate hatched pattern with the words "Private in Holding, not subject to HOA" printed across it in bold capital letters. The man who drew that plat had known what he was doing. He had drawn it in front of my grandfather, in fact, in the kitchen of this house, over coffee, in 1995. What had happened next was not on any map. In 2003, 7 years after the subdivision opened, the HOA dug a basin at the low end of their property and called it a community pond. The basin was unlined, fed by groundwater that did not come close to filling it, and dependent for its picturesque level on whatever surface flow happened to arrive from the north. From me, for the first few summers it stayed half empty. By 2008, the HOA had figured out that if they timed their landscape irrigation to my spillway releases, the pond stayed full enough to host their 4th of July picnic. By 2012, the marketing photos for new lots in the subdivision featured the pond prominently. By 2015, the HOA had stopped explaining where the water came from at all. I had let it happen. I had let it happen because my wife liked watching the kids fish there in the spring, and because for most of those years, I had been releasing more flow than my rights required, for no other reason than habit and goodwill. Nobody had ever asked. Nobody had ever thanked me. Nobody had needed to. Water ran where gravity sent it, and I had a dam that gave me the option of being generous. Generosity, I was beginning to understand, had been mistaken for surrender. I sat down at the desk and pulled the lockbox out of the bottom drawer. It was a steel document safe, the kind you bolt to a floor joist, and the key was on the same ring as my truck keys. Inside were the 3 documents that mattered. The first was a sheet of cream-colored paper, folded in thirds, issued by the State Water Resources Office in 1953. Certificate of Appropriation Number 1953 WR0214, issued to one Walter Hollis, my grandfather, for the use of the spring on the Upper Bramble Creek parcel. Senior priority, permanent, transferable by deed. In the language of water law in our state, His right to that water predated every other claim in the valley. The second was the certified copy of the 1996 plat, with the inholding pattern over my parcel, and the printed words, "Private, inholding not subject to OA," still legible in the margin. The third was the 2014 deed transferring the parcel and all attached water rights from my grandfather's estate to me, recorded at the county, and stamped by a notary I had known since I was 12. I laid all three on the kitchen table side by side. Together, they said one thing. They said that the water on this land had belonged to my family before Diane Whitaker had been born, and that no homeowners association in this county or any other had ever held 1 ounce of authority over a single drop of it. I sat with that for a while. I had assumed, for 4 months, that the HOA's letters were a clerical mistake by an overzealous board. I had been wrong. Watching Diane stand on my dam that morning, with a phone camera and a clipboard, I had finally understood. They genuinely believed they had the authority to fine me. They had built that belief on the unexamined fact that water had been arriving in their pond for years, and they had never had to ask why. Belief, unchecked, was about to meet hydrology. I gathered the 3 documents and laid them gently on top of the closed wooden box of HOA notices, like setting a stone slab over a grave that did not yet know it was a grave. Outside, the morning had warmed. I could hear a redtail calling somewhere over the ridge. Friday was 4 days away. I had time. Thursday afternoon, I drove into town. The county records office gave me 3 certified copies each of the deed, the 1996 plat, and the water rights certificate. The clerk pulled my files without asking why I needed them, though she watched me a beat, longer than usual, on the way out. The way people do in a small county when they have heard something at church and are trying to decide whether to mention it. Half an hour later, I had 9 certified documents in a manila envelope on the seat beside me. I drove 4 blocks to the sheriff's substation and walked in through the glass door at the front. The deputy on intake was young, polite, and visibly bored. I told him I was not there to file a complaint. I was there to make a courtesy entry into the log. An HOA board, of which I was not a member, had sent me notices threatening to physically enter my property to operate equipment they did not own, and I wanted the visit on record before it happened. He blinked twice. He pulled up a form. He took my name, my address, the case I was raising. He typed in a non-emergency reference number and slid a printed copy across the counter. "If they show up," he said, "you call us. Don't engage." "I won't engage, sir. With respect, people say that, and then they engage." "I won't engage, son. I'll be half a mile up the ridge with binoculars." He almost smiled. He did not quite. He stamped my copy and let me go. I drove home with the case number tucked into the manila envelope, and I sat at my kitchen table and made one more decision. I would not be at the dam on Friday morning. I would let them come. I had been a civil engineer for 36 years before I retired. The last 14 of those I had spent in hydrology, mostly on irrigation districts and small impoundments. Mostly in counties not unlike this one. I had testified twice in administrative hearings about water rights, and once in a federal case about an upstream diversion. I knew, professionally, what a homeowners association could and could not do. And I knew, personally, that what Diane Whitaker was about to do on Friday morning was going to be the most useful thing she had ever done for me. She was going to come onto my land with witnesses, with a contractor, and with a cell phone camera, and she was going to attempt to operate machinery she had no authority to touch. The smartest thing I could do was let her. Thursday evening, I climbed the back trail in the last of the light and mounted a second trail camera in the cedar above the access gate, angled down at the chain. I tested it. I checked the battery. I left it. Then I walked the dam itself, top to bottom, the way I had walked it 1,000 times in my life. Spillway clear, primary gate seated, secondary release valve free, pump house locked. I clipped a small lavalier audio recorder, voice activated, to the underside of a flange beside the gate wheel, out of sight, unless you knew where to look, but close enough to catch a conversation at normal speaking volume. I went home. I slept like a man who had finally stopped waiting for something. Friday morning, I parked my truck on the fire road that ran along the top of the ridge, half a mile above the dam, and I sat in the cab with a thermos of coffee and a pair of loop-holed binoculars I had owned since 1991. At 9:14 a.m., a white SUV, a black pickup, and a backhoe on a flatbed trailer turned off the county road and onto my access lane. I lifted the binoculars. Diane Whitaker stepped out of the SUV in jeans and a fleece vest. Two men I recognized from the HOA board, a tall one named Grant and a shorter one whose name I could not remember got out of the pickup. The backhoe driver, a heavy-set man, in a gray work shirt with a contractor's logo on the sleeve, stayed in his cab. Diane walked up to my access gate. She tested the chain. She turned to one of the boardmen. He produced a pair of long-handled bolt cutters from the bed of the pickup. I watched, through the binoculars, half a mile away and 400 feet up, while a sitting president of a homeowners association cut the padlock off the access gate of a man who was not a member of her HOA, on a parcel that was not part of her subdivision, in front of 2 of her board members and a hired contractor and a cell phone camera held in her own hand. The chain dropped into the dirt. Diane lifted the phone, turned it on herself, and began to speak. I could not hear her from the ridge. The trail cam at the gate was getting every word. So was the lavalier at the dam, 200 yards inside the property line, the moment they drove past it. The contractor's flatbed and the SUV in the pickup all moved through the open gate and continued down the lane toward the dam. I lowered the binoculars and reached for the thermos. The audio came back clean that afternoon. I listened to it twice. The clearest sequence was the one I had hoped for. All right, gentlemen. The contractor is going to open the primary gates manually. We're documenting full compliance with the community's enforcement order. A second voice, the contractor. Ma'am, I'm sorry. What is this gear? I don't recognize this make. Diane, it's just a gate. Open it. The contractor. Ma'am, this is industrial. I opened something I don't know on land that isn't yours. That's on me. I need to see paperwork from the owner. Diane, I am the owner's authority. The HOA board. The contractor. Ma'am, paperwork from him. A long silence on the recording. Wind in the cedars. Then Diane again, sharper, addressing one of the boardmen. Fine. Leave it. We'll have the sheriff force him to do it Monday. A pause. Then quieter, but plainly audible the line that would matter later. The community will take what's ours. The recording continued for another 3 minutes, boots crunching on gravel, doors slamming, the diesel cough of the backhoe's flatbed pulling out, and then it cut to silence. They had gotten exactly nothing done. They had cut a lock that was not theirs to cut. They had trespassed onto a parcel that was not theirs to enter. They had attempted to direct a contractor to operate equipment they did not own. They had broadcast the entire approach on a Facebook live stream, which Renee, who I would not formally meet for another 24 hours, was already quietly archiving. And Diane had said, on tape, in her own voice, that the community would take what was theirs. I drove down to the dam at dusk, alone. The orange notice was still taped to the gate wheel. I left it where it was. I checked the spillway. I checked the secondary release valve. I made one small adjustment, a quarter turn on the bypass, to move the eastern channel back into operating tolerance after a long summer of disuse, and I wrote 3 numbers in a pocket notebook. Current pond level. Current flow rate. The weekly volume the HOA pond and Diane Whitaker's irrigation lines had been pulling, on average, from my goodwill overflow for the last 6 summers. The third number was bigger than I had expected. I closed the notebook. I replaced the padlock on the access gate with a new one I had bought that afternoon, heavier chain, harder steel, and I walked back up the trail in the gathering dark. They thought cutting my lock was the bold move. They had no idea the bold move would be me leaving the gates exactly where they wanted them until Saturday. Saturday morning came in cool and clear, and a gray sedan I did not recognize turned up my driveway just after 8. I was on the porch with a second cup of coffee when it pulled in. The driver got out slowly, a small, white-haired man in a windbreaker and Sunday shoes, holding a thick manila folder against his chest, like he was afraid the wind might take it. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Mr. Hollis," he said. "I'm Tomas Alvarez. I live on lot 41 inches Bramble Creek. I owe you an apology." And I brought coffee. He held up a paper cup in his other hand. I waved him onto the porch. Tomas was 73. He had been fined $400 by Diane in May for a mailbox the county itself had told him to install. He had paid because his wife was sick and he had not wanted the fight. He set the folder on the porch railing between us. "After what she did at your gate yesterday," he said, "I opened this for the first time in 2 years. I want you to see what's in it." The folder was full of fines. Not just his, other people's. Photocopies he had been quietly collecting since the day his own had arrived, because he had wanted to know if he was the only one. He was not. There were 47 separate citations in that folder, issued to 19 different households over 4 years, and a startling number of them had been signed by Diane Whitaker after her election to the board 14 months earlier. I read through them on the porch while he drank his coffee. A widow on Lot 12 had been threatened with a lien over a $600 drainage assessment the bylaws did not authorize. A young couple on Lot 28 had been fined $1,200 over the color of a fence the bylaws did not regulate. An elderly veteran on Lot 7 had been ordered to remove a flagpole the county had permitted in 1998. There was a pattern in the language of the citations, the same phrasing, the same legal-sounding boilerplate, the same final paragraph, threatening foreclosure proceedings if the homeowner did not comply within 30 days. It was the same paragraph that had been on every letter in my walnut box. Diane Whitaker had a template. I closed the folder. "Mr. Alvarez," I said, "why are you bringing this to me?" He looked at me a long moment. "Because yesterday I watched a live stream of her cutting your lock," he said, "and I realized something I should have realized 2 years ago when I paid that mailbox fine. She was never going to stop. She was only going to keep going until somebody made her stop. And I am too old, and my wife is too sick, and I am too tired to be that person." He nodded toward the folder. "But I can be the man who hands the folder to that person." I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say anything. I poured him a fresh cup of coffee from my pot, and we sat on the porch in the cool morning sun, two old men who had not known each other an hour ago, watching a hawk turn over the ridge. The second car arrived an hour later. The woman who got out was somewhere in her late 40s, dressed for a Saturday, but moving like a person on a schedule. She introduced herself as Renee Whitaker, and when she saw my face, she added, immediately, "No relation. Married into a different Whitaker. Divorced 8 years. The name is the only thing of his I kept, and only because changing it back was more paperwork than I had patience for." She had been on the Bramble Creek HOA board for 3 years. Diane had pushed her out 6 months ago. The reason, Renee told me on my porch, was that Renee had asked too many questions about a particular line item in the HOA budget, specifically why the community pond's water bill had dropped to 0 in 2008 and never gone back up, and had asked, in a board meeting, whether anyone had ever actually verified the source. Diane had called for a vote of no confidence the following month. Renee had not been quiet about it on the way out. She had taken her board email archive with her on a personal hard drive, which, she pointed out, the bylaws permitted board members to do as part of their personal records. She had not opened the archive in 6 months. After watching Friday's live stream, she had opened it the night before. She handed me a USB drive. "There are about 4,000 emails on there," she said. "I haven't read them all, but I searched for your name and I searched for the word upstream, and I want you to see 2 threads in particular before anyone else does." I plugged the USB into my laptop on the kitchen table. The first thread was from March of this year, between Diane and the HOA's contracted property manager. Diane had written, in plain text, that she wanted the upstream landowner brought into compliance with community water assessments. The property manager, to his credit, had written back that the upstream parcel was not within HOA jurisdiction per the 1996 plat and the original CC and Rs, and that any attempt to issue fines against it would be outside the board's enforcement authority. Diane had replied, 3 minutes later, with a sentence that I read twice and then read again to be sure. "Then we'll make it within jurisdiction. The pond is the community's." The property manager had not responded. The second thread was from April. Diane had instructed him, in writing, to begin preparing standard non-compliance documentation for my address, so that when the time comes, the paperwork is already in motion. The property manager had replied with a single sentence, "Acknowledged. Please be advised this approach exposes the association to legal risk." Diane had written back, "That's my call to make." I closed the laptop. I sat for a moment in my own kitchen with 2 strangers, both of them quiet, both of them watching me, both of them having brought me, on a Saturday morning, the kind of evidence that does not normally arrive at a private residence. Renee finally spoke. "She has been doing this for years, Mr. Hollis. She started small. Mailboxes, paint colors, fences. By the time I left the board, she was doing it on a schedule. Pick a household. Build a fine. Threaten a lien. Most people pay. She makes a quarterly enforcement report. The board claps. The pond stays full." She paused. "And then she went after you. And I think she did it because she finally believed her own report. I understood. I understood it the way a man understands the weather just before it changes, not from any single sign, but from the accumulated quietness of small things. I pulled the bylaws of the Bramble Creek Estates Homeowners Association from my own files, printed, indexed, a copy I had requested from the county years ago, when I had first received a vague flyer about a neighborhood improvement initiative, and wanted to know what authority the people sending it actually had. The relevant section was on page 4. Article 2, Section 1. Authority of the association is bounded by the legal description of Bramble Creek Estates, as platted on the 18th of April 1996, and recorded at the Franklin County Recorder's Office, volume 412, page 88. No assessment, fine, or enforcement action shall extend to property outside the legally platted subdivision. That was the sentence. 61 words, in plain English, in the founding document of Diane's own organization. An HOA is a contract that binds the people who sign it. It cannot reach across the property line and bind a man who never did. Lawyers call that ultra-vires beyond the power. Diane had been signing fines beyond her power for 14 months. She had just done it to the wrong man. After Mr. Alvarez and Renee left, I walked down to the dam alone in the late afternoon. The orange notice was still taped to the gate wheel, slightly curled now in the dry air, and I left it where it was. I stood at the spillway for a long time. The original creek bed of Bramble Creek had never run south through the community pond. The pond was an excavated basin, offset from the real drainage. The natural channel ran east, then south-southeast, through a shallow draw on my land, and out through the back row of the subdivision, lots 1 through 8, along a seasonal drainage easement that the 1,996 plat had reserved precisely for this purpose. Easement 1. No fill, no obstruction. Lot 3 was Diane Whitaker's. Open the primary gates. Close the southern bypass that had been quietly feeding the pond for 2 decades. The pond would drop. The eastern creek would run for the first time in 20 years. And every drop of it would be the lawful exercise of senior priority my water, returning to the path the plat itself had drawn for it. I checked my watch. 4 days until Diane's Monday with the sheriff. Plenty of time to do this legally, on my own schedule, without raising my voice once. I walked back up the trail in the gathering dusk, and I did not think about Diane Whitaker again that night. Sunday morning I came out onto the porch with my coffee and saw the nail before I saw the paper. It was driven straight into the wood of my front door, dead center, just below the brass knocker. A heavy framing nail, hammered hard enough that the head sat flush against a folded sheet of cream-colored paper pinned underneath it. I stood on the porch a moment with the coffee in my hand and looked at the damage to the door. The door was 82 years old. My grandfather had hung it in 1944, after he came back from the war. I set the coffee down on the railing. I went inside, got a claw hammer and a clean rag from the kitchen drawer, came back out, and worked the nail free as carefully as I could without splintering the wood around it. The nail came out with a small, dry sound. I caught the paper as it dropped. There was a single hole in the door now, neat and round, about the diameter of a pencil. I held the paper up to the morning light. It was a lien. A formal, recorded, county-stamped lien, filed Friday afternoon, 4 hours after Diane Whitaker had walked off my dam with her phone camera. Bramble Creek Estates Homeowners Association v. The parcel at my address, in the amount of $4,800 in accumulated water hoarding fines plus enforcement costs. Stamped, dated, recorded against the title of land that had been in my family for 3 generations. She had not just sent me a notice this time. She had attached her claim to my house. I read the lien twice, standing on the porch, and the second time I read it, I noticed the recording stamp at the top, filed at 3:47 p.m., Friday afternoon. About 45 minutes after she had pulled out of my access lane with her bolt cutters and her contractor, she had gone straight from cutting my lock to the courthouse. I stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the small round hole in my grandfather's door. I thought about the morning he had hung it. I thought about my wife, who used to lean against the frame and watch me come up from the dam at dusk. Then I thought about Diane Whitaker driving from my access road to the courthouse with bolt cutter chips still on her shoes. I went inside and called Hal. Hal Petrocelli had handled my deed transfer in 2014, and before that he had handled my wife's estate, and before that he had been my mother's lawyer for 26 years. He was a real estate attorney who had practiced in this county since I was in junior high school. He had a softer voice than most people expected, and a very long memory. He picked up on the third ring. "Earl," he said. "Hal. They filed a lien on the parcel." "A pause. They what?" "Bramble Creek HOA. Recorded Friday afternoon. $4,800. Accumulated water hoarding fines." A longer pause. Then a single low laugh. The kind a man lets out when something genuinely surprises him after 40 years in the same line of work. "Earl, your parcel isn't part of that HOA." "I know. It's never been part of that HOA. I know. They have no authority to assess you, much less lien you. I know, Hal. There was a silence on the line. The kind of silence that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Earl, don't move on it yet. Don't file anything. Don't dispute it. You let them keep talking. You save everything. In our state, recording a lien against a parcel you have no legal claim to is called slander of title, and it is actionable, and the dollar exposure is not small. But that play is later. Right now you bank the receipts and you let them dig. That's what I figured. How are you doing? I'm fine. Earl, I'm fine. Halt. He let the silence sit, the way old friends are allowed to. Call me when it's time, he said. I'll be ready. I hung up. I did not file anything. What I did was print 3 more copies of the 1,953 water rights certificate, and I put one in the lockbox at the house, one in the glove compartment of my truck, and one in a sealed manila envelope at the county recorder's office, under the standing instruction that it be opened in the event of any administrative challenge to my parcel's water rights. Belt and suspenders, my grandfather had called that. I drove home from the courthouse the long way, along the Ridge Road, where you could see the whole valley laid out below. You could see the entrance sign of Bramble Creek Estates from up there, and the 2 ornamental fountains beside it, and the curve of the community pond glinting in the late morning sun. From the ridge, it all looked very small. I drove home, and I checked the mail. Among the bills and the seed catalogs there was a folded flyer printed on cardstock. Glossy, the HOA's gold foil crest at the top, announcing a special enforcement update at the Bramble Creek Community Center, Tuesday evening at 7, open to all residents. The flyer included a photograph of Diane Whitaker, smiling broadly, in front of the community pond. The headline read, "Protecting what we built together." I read it on the porch, in the same chair where I had pulled the nail out of my door an hour earlier. She was going to brag about me. She had filed a lien on my house, recorded it 45 minutes after trespassing on my property, and she was now going to stand on a stage in front of her neighbors on Tuesday evening and brag about the homeowner she had brought into compliance. I checked the calendar in my head. Today was Sunday. Tuesday evening was 60 hours away. 60 hours was enough time for water to do almost anything. I drove down to the dam at sunset, alone, and I ran my hand along the gate wheel. The orange notice from Friday morning was still taped to the iron, slightly more curled now, the adhesive starting to give in the dry mountain air. I left it where it was. I had my reasons. I checked the spillway. I checked the secondary release. I unlocked the bypass valve cover and inspected the seal, which had not been operated in nearly 15 years and which still moved cleanly when I tested it with a quarter turn. I closed it again. I locked the cover. I took out the pocket notebook from Friday and I wrote, beneath the 3 numbers I had recorded then, a 4th, Monday 0600. I underlined it once. That was the time I would open the primary gates. 6 in the morning, Monday, alone, on my own land, in the lawful exercise of a water right my grandfather had filed when Eisenhower was president. Within 4 hours the primary spillway flow would shift fully into the eastern channel. By Tuesday morning, the community pond would be a mud flat. By Tuesday evening, when Diane Whitaker was on stage, smiling for a microphone, telling her neighbors how she had protected what they had built together, the eastern creek behind her own house would be running clear for the first time in 20 years. I closed the notebook. I walked back up the trail in the gathering dusk. I made dinner. I read for an hour. I went to bed. I slept the way a man sleeps when he has finally decided to stop subsidizing his own bullies. She had filed a lien on a parcel her HOA had no authority over, and in doing so she had just signed the document that would end her presidency. But before any of that, before the lawyers and the lien releases, and the recall vote, and the audit, and the public meeting, and the reckoning of every household she had bullied for 14 months. Before any of that, the gates were going to open at 6 in the morning, and the water was going to handle the rest. I opened the primary gates at 6:02 a.m. on Monday morning. I walked down the trail in the mist with the chest cam running and the folded orange notice from Friday in my shirt pocket. The cedars dripped in the early dark. The dam smelled the way it always smelled at that hour: wet stone, iron, the slight green of moss along the spillway lip. I placed my hand on the iron wheel my grandfather had installed in 1953. I turned it open in 3 full revolutions. The water came through the primary spillway with the low, clean rush of water that had been waiting a long time to do exactly what it had always been supposed to do. I closed the southern bypass valve at 6:09. By 6:15, the eastern channel was running steady, and the original Bramble Creek bed dry leaves, gravel, the ghost of a creek began, beneath my watch, to be a creek again. I spoke once into the chest cam, for the timestamp, releasing primary gates per certificate 1953WR0214, closing southern bypass. Drainage following the platted easement east, per the 1996 plat of Bramble Creek Estates. 48 seconds. Time-stamped, geolocated, witnessed by the camera on my chest and the camera in the cedar. I walked back up the trail and ate breakfast. The first call came into the HOA emergency line just before noon, Monday. A homeowner on Lot 4 directly behind Diane Whitaker's lot found water moving through the seasonal drainage easement at the back of her property, not flooding, running, ankle deep, exactly the volume the 1996 plat had designed the easement to carry. She called the HOA because she did not know who else to call. The HOA property manager logged the call as a non-urgent drainage observation and forwarded it to Diane. Diane was, at that moment, rehearsing her remarks for Tuesday evening. She did not return the call. By Monday evening, the community pond was visibly lower. By Tuesday morning, the fountains beside the entrance sign were running shallow and beginning to spit air. By Tuesday at noon, the pond was a brown bowl with a ring of cracked clay where the water line had been the week before, and the lawn at the entrance. The lawn that had been the visual identity of Bramble Creek Estates for 15 years had begun to brown at the edges. The property manager called Diane 3 times Tuesday afternoon. She let it go to voicemail. She was finalizing her speech. I walked into the community center Tuesday evening at 6:55, in a clean button-down shirt and the pair of work boots I wore to town, carrying a manila folder under my arm. The room was full. I had expected 40 regulars. There were over 120 people in folding chairs and another 20 standing along the back wall. Word had moved through the subdivision over the weekend, the way it does in places where people know each other's mailboxes. I took a seat in the back corner. Nobody recognized me. I had counted on that. Mr. Alvarez sat in the third row on the aisle. Renee sat 2 seats over from him with a laptop open across her knees and a small projector remote in her hand. The contractor from Friday, the man who had refused to operate my gate, sat near the door in a clean shirt and a baseball cap, his arms folded, looking like a man who had not wanted to be there but had decided to be there anyway. Diane Whitaker walked to the podium at 7 on the dot. She was wearing a navy blazer. She had a clipped, pleased smile, and she was holding her phone in one hand the way someone holds a phone when they intend to record themselves looking competent. She tapped the microphone. "Good evening, neighbors." The room quieted. "Tonight," she said, "is a special enforcement update on a matter the board has been pursuing for several months. As your president, I want to share with you what we have accomplished and what your community stands to gain through firm, principled enforcement of our shared values." A few people clapped. Most did not. She named me from the podium. She used my full name and my address, and she told the room I was a selfish, upstream resident who has been hoarding community springwater for personal benefit. She announced the lien proudly. She said the words $4,800 slowly and clearly so the back rows could hear them. She said the board had acted decisively to recover what is rightfully the community's. Then she said it. "This water belongs to the community." It was the same sentence she had said on my dam at 6 in the morning on Friday, into the same kind of phone she was holding now. I had it on tape. Renee had it on tape. The chest cam had it on tape from a different angle. 3 independent recordings of the same 6 words, said by the same woman, 3 days apart, with growing confidence each time. She said the community will take what's ours, almost word for word from the lavalier audio. She said we will not be held hostage by one man's selfishness. A few people clapped again. Mr. Alvarez was looking at the floor. Renee was watching her laptop screen. I was watching Diane Whitaker's husband. He was in the front row, second seat in. Heavy man, 60s, gray at the temples, in a Carhartt jacket he had not taken off. He had not clapped once. He had been frowning since Diane said the word lien, and he was beginning, slowly, to take his phone out of his pocket. Mr. Alvarez stood up. He walked, unhurried, to the back of the room, and he came up the side aisle along the front row and stopped at the second seat. He bent down. He held a phone his own angled, so that only Diane's husband could see the screen. I could not see what was on the screen from the back of the room. I did not need to. I had taken those photos myself, on my walk down to the dam an hour earlier, and I had texted them to Mr. Alvarez before I had walked into the community center. The community pond from the eastern berm at 5:45 p.m. Tuesday, a brown clay bowl with a heron standing in the middle of it, looking confused. Diane's husband stared at the phone. He blinked twice. He stood up. He walked to the podium and put his hand over the microphone and leaned in and said something quietly to his wife. I could not hear what he said. I watched her face. Her smile faltered in a small, specific way. I will remember the rest of my life the way a person's face moves when the floor underneath them changes texture but they have not yet looked down. She covered the mic and asked him something. He nodded once. She asked something else. He nodded again. She turned back to the room and tried, gamely, to find her smile. As I was saying, she began. The board's enforcement. I stood up, not loudly, the way a man stands at the end of a long Sunday. I picked up the manila folder and walked down the center aisle. A few heads turned, then most of them. By the time I reached the front of the room, Diane Whitaker had stopped talking. She was looking at me. She did not know who I was. For one full breath in a very quiet room, the woman who had been signing fines against my parcel for 14 months, the woman who had nailed a lien to the door of a house she had never seen, who had said my name into a microphone 3 minutes earlier, who had called me selfish on a stage in front of my neighbors, looked at me without recognition. I let her have the breath. Outside, the creek behind her house was running clear for the first time since the Reagan administration. Inside, she was still looking at me, trying to remember if she had ever seen me before. I stopped at the front of the room and held out the manila folder. Diane Whitaker did not take it. She looked at the folder, then at my face, then back at the folder, and I watched her trying to place me running through the catalog of residents she had spent 14 months categorizing into compliant, non-compliant, and not yet fined. I was not in any of those categories. Mr. Hollis, I said, quietly, for her ears. The blood went out of her face in one clean motion. I set the folder on the podium beside her microphone, and I turned to face the room. I did not raise my voice. I have never had to. My name is Earl Hollis, I said. I own the parcel directly upstream of this subdivision. I am not a member of this homeowners association. My land has never been part of Bramble Creek Estates. The water Mrs. Whitaker has been calling community property has belonged to my family since 1953. The room was very still. I'd like to take 1 minute of your time. Renee, in the third row, tapped the projector remote. The screen behind Diane lit up with a copy of the 1996 plat of Bramble Creek Estates. The hatched private inholding pattern over my parcel was clearly visible. The words private inholding not subject to HOA were legible from the back row. This is the plat that founded your subdivision, I said. It was recorded at the Franklin County Recorder's Office in April of 1996, volume 412, page 88. My parcel, the hatched area at the top, is explicitly excluded. Your bylaws, Article 2, Section 1, bind your authority to this map. Anything outside it is outside your reach. I paused. That has been true since the day your association was incorporated. Renee tapped the remote again. The screen changed to the cream-colored 1953 Water Rights Certificate. Walter Hollis. Senior Priority Appropriation. The seal of the State Water Resources Office. The date. 43 years before the first lot in Bramble Creek was sold. My grandfather filed this in 1953, I said. Older water right, stronger claim. That is the rule in this state, and it has been the rule in this state for 140 years. The water on my land was legally mine 43 years before the foundation of your community pond was poured. Someone in the third row exhaled audibly. I turned to Diane. Mrs. Whitaker, 3 days ago, you stood on my dam and told a phone camera that this water belonged to the community. I have that recording. You repeated the same sentence on this stage 4 minutes ago. I have that recording too. Renee tapped the remote a third time. The screen filled with the chest cam footage from Monday morning at 6:02. 48 seconds. My voice, time-stamped, geolocated, narrating the legal basis of the gate opening. Certificate 1950 și 3WR214. Closing southern bypass. Drainage following the platted easement east, per the 1996 plat. The footage played. The room watched. When it ended, I spoke once more. I did not flood anyone. I redirected my water to the path your own subdivision plat shows it was always supposed to take. The pond out front was being fed by my goodwill, not your bylaws. I stopped the goodwill on Monday. The water did the rest. Diane reached for the microphone. Il est here. Mr. Hollis, her voice cracked once. She steadied it. There seems to be an unrelated maintenance issue with the pond which we'll address in due course. As for the lien, the board's enforcement authority, you filed the lien at 3:47 on Friday afternoon, I said. She stopped. 45 minutes after you cut the chain on my access gate. She stopped completely. Renee tapped the remote. The trail cam footage came up. Diane, on Friday morning, in her fleece vest, working the bolt cutters, the chain dropping, the phone camera, the board members, the flatbed. I let it play for 10 seconds. I did not need more. When Renee paused it, I placed a single printed sheet on the podium and turned it so the room could see. This is an email Mrs. Whitaker sent her own property manager in March of this year. He told her, in writing, that my parcel was outside HOA jurisdiction and that fining me would be outside the board's enforcement authority. Her reply is the line at the bottom. I read it aloud, once, in the same flat voice. Then we'll make it within jurisdiction. The pond is the community's. The room did not react in a wave. It reacted in a slow, rolling silence, chair by chair, row by row, as 140 people understood, simultaneously, that the woman they had elected 14 months earlier had told her own property manager, in writing, that she intended to manufacture authority she did not possess. Mr. Alvarez stood up in the third row. She fined me $400 in May, he said, his voice steady, for a mailbox the county told me to install. A woman in the fifth row stood up. The widow from Lot 12. She was holding a folded piece of paper. She did not say anything. She just held it up so the room could see what it was. A young man 2 rows behind her stood up. $1,200 for a fence color that isn't in the bylaws, he said. The contractor by the door stood up next, and he took off his cap, and he addressed the room without raising his voice. On Friday morning, Mrs. Whitaker hired me to operate equipment on Mr. Hollis's land. When I asked for owner paperwork, she told me she was the owner's authority. I left without operating anything. I have my invoice and my work log if anyone needs them. Renee stood up last. I have 3 years of board emails, she said. I have 4,000 of them. Anyone who paid a fine in the last 14 months should ask the next board to look at them. There were 3 other board members in the front row. They looked at each other for 90 seconds without speaking. Then the senior of them, a retired school teacher named Karen Beecher, and yes, that was her name, and no, the irony was not lost on me, stood up and walked to the side of the podium and called for an emergency motion. Motion to suspend the president pending a community vote. Seconded. 3-0 in the room. Diane Whitaker sat down. She did not cry. She did not argue. She sat down in the chair beside the podium and she looked at her hands. And she looked at her husband, who was no longer in his seat, who had walked out the back door of the community center 2 minutes earlier and had not come back, and she looked at me. I reached into my shirt pocket and I took out the orange notice from Friday morning, folded twice, the adhesive long since gone gray. I placed it gently on the podium beside her microphone. I did not say anything when I did it. I did not need to. I picked up my manila folder, and I walked back up the center aisle, and I went out into the parking lot. The night was cool and very quiet. Somewhere behind the subdivision, the eastern creek was running clear under the streetlights for the first time since the Reagan administration. I stood beside my truck for a moment and listened. I could not hear the creek from where I was standing, but I knew it was there. The lien was released at the county recorder's office at 4:11 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, 72 hours after the community center meeting. Hal called me with the recording number while I was on the porch. They didn't fight it, he said. Their lawyer signed it before lunch. I thanked him. I hung up. I went back to my coffee. The recall vote happened the following Saturday at the same community center, in the same folding chairs, with most of the same faces. 47-12. Diane Whitaker was no longer president of the Bramble Creek Estates Homeowners Association. 2 more board members resigned the same evening rather than face the audit Renee had already begun organizing. Karen Beecher, the retired school teacher, who had earned the name back from me 1 motion at a time, became interim president. Her first act was to issue a written, notarized acknowledgement that my parcel was outside HOA jurisdiction and that no future fines, notices, or assessments would be issued against it. She brought it up to the house herself. She handed it to me on the porch, with an apology she had clearly written down ahead of time so she would not lose her words. I accepted both. Hal sent 1 letter to Diane's attorney about the slander of title, the cut padlock, and the nail in my grandfather's door. She settled privately. $7,800, paid out of her own checking account, not the HOA's. I gave the entire amount to a small county legal aid fund that had been helping the widow on Lot 12 fight the foreclosure threat that had been weighing on her for 9 months. The widow's threat was withdrawn within the week. 11 other fines from Diane's tenure were reversed in the audit. 2 months later, Renee ran for board president on a one-line platform, "Stay in our lane," and won unopposed. The HOA, for the first time since 2008, began paying market rate for well water to keep the community pond filled. Their next quarterly assessment went up $40 a household. Nobody complained. Most of them, by then, understood that the cheap water had never been free. It had been a gift from the man on the ridge, and the man on the ridge had finally been asked to stop giving it. Diane Whitaker's house went on the market 6 weeks after the recall vote. It sold in 11 days. I was invited to one community potluck in late September. I went. I brought cornbread. I stayed an hour. I left before dark. The Eastern Creek kept running. Kids from the subdivision found it within a month. First one, then 3, then a small, loose pack of them, with fishing rods and bare feet and the easy ignorance of children about property lines. They fished the lower stretch, behind what had once been Diane Whitaker's house and was now somebody else's. The new owners did not seem to mind. The creek became, ironically, the thing the HOA had always claimed the pond was: a community waterway, a place where children learned the names of small fish. It belonged entirely to me, of course. Every drop above the ridge. The deed was clear on that. I never mentioned it. The walnut box on my desk sat empty after that fall. I emptied the 7 HOA letters into the wood stove one morning in October, on a cold day when I needed the kindling, and I watched the gold foil crests curl and blacken and go to ash. The box itself I cleaned out with a soft cloth and lined with a piece of muslin. I started keeping seed packets in it: tomatoes, pole beans, a variety of summer squash my wife had liked. The dam ran at its lawful rate. I still released a courtesy flow toward the community pond, not because anyone asked, and not because anyone was owed it, but because I had decided, on my own terms, that the herons should still have a place to land in the spring. The amount I released was the amount I chose. The schedule was mine. Nobody on the new board ever sent me a letter about it. Nobody ever will. One morning in early November, just before first light, I walked down the trail to the dam alone. The cedars were dripping. The air smelled the way it had smelled the morning Diane Whitaker had stood on the iron wheel with a clipboard and a phone camera. And for a moment I stood at the head of the spillway and let the memory pass through. I placed my hand on the gate wheel. I did not turn it. I just rested my palm on the cold iron, the same iron my grandfather had installed in 1953. The same wheel. A woman who no longer lived in this valley had once tried to fine me for owning, and I felt the place where my fingers had worn the metal smooth over 30 years of quiet care. From my shirt pocket I took out the orange notice, folded twice. Adhesive long since gone. The phrase, "Hoarding, Springwater," still legible in Diane Whitaker's neat block letter print, the way she had written it the morning she believed she was within her authority. I held it for a moment, then I dropped it in the spillway. The water took it east, down through the stone notch my grandfather had reinforced in 1957, along the easement the 1,996 plat had drawn for it, past the back, lots of the subdivision, past the new owner's house, past the children's fishing spot, and away. It turned out the water knew exactly where it belonged. So did the deed. The only thing that didn't was the woman who had tried to fine me for owning both. I walked back up the trail in the gray light. The morning was very quiet. I made breakfast.